Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity and risk management. In this digital age, it's kind of crazy out there. You sent me those excerpts from building a cyber risk management program. That was Brian Allen and Brandon Bapst.
Yep.
And, we're going to kind of dig into all that and see how businesses can adapt and thrive with all this technology changing so fast. It's changing all the time, right? But I have an expert here with me to help us unpack all this.
Ready when you are.
Perfect. Okay, so the book jumps right into this. Have you heard this term? The Fourth Industrial Revolution. That seems like I hear that everywhere.
Yeah, me too.
So what exactly makes this revolution so unique? And how does it relate to cybersecurity?
I think you're right. It is a bit of a buzzword, but
Yeah.
it is pretty significant, especially when we're talking about cybersecurity. Think about it this way. The first industrial revolution was all about mechanization. And then we had mass production. Electricity came along, and later computers changed everything. So this fourth revolution is building on all of that. But it's like at warp speed. It's this fusion of technologies like AI, robotics. Have you heard of the Internet of Things?
Yeah.
All blurring the lines between the physical and the digital, the real world and the online world.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
That's what the book is arguing, right?
Yeah.
That this creates this whole other level of vulnerability for businesses.
Exactly. Yeah, all this interconnectedness, it just means more devices, more data, more ways to be attacked, more potential entry points for attacks. So yeah, the attack surface is just constantly expanding.
It's a never-ending battle.
Yeah.
So how does this all tie back to those excerpts that you sent?
Well, Allen and Bapst, the authors, they argue that the key is shifting our mindset from like a purely reactive security mindset to a more proactive risk management approach. And they call it risk-informed decision-making.
Did that resonate with you when you were reading that?
Oh, yeah. And you know what I really liked? They use a really simple formula to kind of illustrate this idea. It's risk equals likelihood multiplied by impact.
Okay.
So what that means is when a business is making decisions, they need to think about two things: how likely a cyber incident is to occur and how bad the fallout would be if it did.
Okay. Can you give me an example? Like, say, for a company that's handling sensitive customer data.
Sure. Imagine you're a company and you are deciding where to store your sensitive customer data. Maybe you're thinking about the cloud. So you would first assess the likelihood of a data breach happening, like is it more likely to happen in the cloud or in your current system? And then you'd consider the impact of that breach. So think about financial damage, potential legal issues, and the damage to your reputation. So if the likelihood of a breach is high and the impact would be devastating, well, then that's a huge risk.
It's about weighing those two things together, the likelihood and the impact, not just trying to, prevent every possible attack.
That's exactly right. And that is where this cyber risk management program comes in.
Which they call the CRMP.
Yes. It's a framework to help businesses make those tough decisions about risk. It has 4 main components: agile governance, a risk-informed system, a risk-based strategy and execution, and risk escalation and disclosure.
Wow. Okay.
Wow.
That's a lot to unpack. Let's start with agile governance. What does that even mean when we're talking about cybersecurity?
Agile governance, it's all about being flexible and responsive. It's about having, clear roles and responsibilities, having good communication. It's about everyone being on the same page, like from the top down.
So it's not just the IT people who need to know.
Yeah.
It's everyone, right? From the CEO down to like the interns. Everyone needs to understand these risks.
Yeah. And the authors, they really argue that senior leadership plays a crucial role here. They need to set the tone and really, create that culture of managing cyber risk.
It's like a top-down kind of thing. And there are some pretty big consequences if you don't do this right.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking potential legal liability, financial hits, like big ones, and major damage to your reputation. And I don't know if you've heard, but there are all these new SEC regulations.
I have. I've heard of them.
Yeah, so now public companies are required to report on how they manage cyber risk. So the stakes are higher than ever.
Absolutely. And they use some powerful examples in the book
They do.
to really illustrate these points.
Yes.
The Boeing 737 MAX disasters
Yeah.
and the Uber data breach,
Mhm.
those two really stand out.
Yeah. They're hard to forget.
Let's start with Boeing. I mean, it's a little hard to hear about because of what happened, but it's a stark reminder of what's at stake.
Right.
Can you kind of walk us through how a lack of robust cyber risk management, how could that have contributed to that tragedy?
Yeah. So the investigations, they revealed some serious issues with their flight management system. And it seems like there were some real breakdowns in communication. Some engineers, they had concerns, but it doesn't seem like those concerns were taken seriously enough. Like they weren't addressed properly.
So a failure of agile governance, you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. And it also seems like the risks associated with that system, like they weren't really fully evaluated,
Right.
which points to uh, a weak risk-informed system. And then on top of all that, their strategies seem to prioritize cost and speed over safety.
Wow.
And that is where a stronger risk-based strategy and execution could have made a huge difference.
It makes you realize how important each element of this framework can be.
Yeah.
So what about that Uber example? It seems like that was more about how they handled things after the breach, not necessarily how they prevented it.
Right. So in 2016, hackers stole data from millions of Uber users. But instead of telling anyone, disclosing it, Uber paid the hackers to keep quiet.
Like a cover-up?
Yeah, basically.
That's not exactly how you'd handle a risk.
No. And it backfired. Of course, the breach eventually came out. And it led to, just massive criticism and a ton of legal action.
I remember.
And, serious damage to their reputation.
Transparency and accountability. That's key here, right? So where does the cyber risk management program framework, where does that fit in?
Well, that would fall under risk escalation and disclosure. Having a clear process for reporting and communicating about these incidents, that's super important. Not just to regulators, but to the people who are affected, the people whose data was stolen.
It seems like that's something companies still really struggle with.
It's tough. They are afraid of what will happen if people find out. But, look at Uber. Trying to hide things. It always makes it worse in the long run.
So we've talked a lot about traditional cyber threats, like data breaches. But what about emerging technologies? The book spends a lot of time talking about AI.
Right.
How does that fit into all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. AI has so much potential, but it also introduces this whole new set of risks, things like algorithmic bias, job displacement, and data security concerns. And then there's the potential for misuse by, malicious actors, like hackers.
And, the book specifically mentions something called adversarial machine learning, or AML.
Yeah.
That sounds a little intense.
It is. So imagine an AI system that's designed to identify images, like maybe images of financial transactions. Someone using AML could manipulate an image, like maybe by adding some tiny pixels that you can't even see, and they could trick the AI into misclassifying it.
So it's basically hacking the AI itself.
Pretty much, yeah. And, that's why the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they actually published a report on AML. It's to help organizations understand and address these risks.
Sounds like essential reading for anyone who's working with AI these days.
Yeah.
So as you consider all of this, is there anything that stands out to you about how these AI risks might affect your own field of work?
Yeah. It's definitely made me think a lot more about the data that we use to train our AI models.
Right.
There's the potential for bias creeping in without us even realizing it.
Right, yeah.
And, the security implications are huge. If someone can manipulate our algorithms, that could affect our entire business.
Yeah. It seems like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. And I think this just highlights how important it is for businesses to be proactive. Really think through these risks before they jump into AI implementation.
Before they just dive in.
Yeah.
Head first.
Head first, exactly.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is.
A little bit terrifying, too.
Yeah, I agree. It really is. It's a very powerful technology with a lot of potential, but also some serious risks.
So let's kind of shift gears a little bit and go back to that CRMP framework we were talking about. It was developed before AI really took off. So how can it help businesses deal with all these new challenges? AI is everywhere now.
That's a really great question. And it's actually something the authors talk about in the book. The great thing about the CRMP is that it's adaptable. It's not like a rigid checklist.
Right.
It's more like a set of principles that you can use for any type of cyber risk, including the risks that come with AI.
So it's more like a philosophy than a checklist.
Yeah, exactly. It's about creating a culture of cyber resilience in your company and empowering everyone to be aware of the risks and how to manage them.
I like that. Cyber resilience. So, okay, let's go back to those 4 components we were talking about. Agile governance, risk-informed system, risk-based strategy and execution, and risk escalation and disclosure.
Hmm.
How do those actually work when it comes to something like, implementing AI? Let's start with agile governance.
Okay, so with AI, agile governance is more important than ever because, as we've seen, the AI world changes really fast, so it's important to be flexible.
Be able to adapt.
Exactly, to make quick decisions, informed decisions about risks. And that means you need to have a really clear understanding of who is responsible for what, like when it comes to the AI. From collecting data to developing the algorithms to actually using the AI.
So clear lines of responsibility
Yeah.
and the ability to adapt.
Yeah.
Got it. What about that risk-informed system?
Right. So with AI, that basically means having a way to gather data and analyze it. But it's not just about potential cyber threats anymore. You also need data about the AI systems themselves. Think about, are there biases in the data we are using? Are there vulnerabilities in the algorithms themselves? And are the decisions that the AI is making, are they ethical? Can we explain them?
It seems like that would be a lot of data,
Yeah.
and you'd need a lot of expertise to analyze it.
Yeah, it's true. And it's something a lot of companies are still trying to figure out.
I bet.
But it is essential to have that kind of information to make good decisions about using AI.
And then, once you have that information, that's where the risk-based strategy and execution comes in.
Exactly. This is where you make the tough decisions. Like, do you move forward with a certain AI project even if there are risks? Do you try to change it to make it less risky? Or do you just scrap the whole thing?
Wow.
Yeah, these are big decisions, and they need to be made strategically, and they have to be based on your company's goals and how much risk they are willing to take.
So weighing the benefits against the potential downsides.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And, with AI, things change quickly. That's why that agile governance is so important.
Makes sense. Okay, last one. Risk escalation and disclosure. How does that work with AI? It seems like things happen so fast with AI that, by the time you realize something is wrong, it might be too late.
That's a good point. It's a valid concern. And that's exactly why you need to have really clear procedures for escalation. So if your AI system starts acting weird, or if there's some kind of incident, you need to know who to tell and how to get that information to the right people quickly. And then, just like with any cyber incident, you have to be transparent. If something goes wrong, you need to be prepared to talk about it, both inside the company and publicly, and take responsibility.
So the core principles of this CRMP framework, they're still relevant, right?
Mhm.
Even with all this new AI stuff.
Definitely. It's not about getting rid of the old ways. It's about adapting to the new reality.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit now. Look at the bigger picture. We've talked a lot about specific risks, but what are some of the big trends, the big challenges that you see that are going to shape the future of risk management in general?
Well, one thing that worries me is how complex things are getting. It's not just about cyber threats anymore. We have all these risks converging. Technological risks, geopolitical risks, economic risks, and social risks. And they're all connected.
Can you give me an example of how all that might play out?
Sure. Imagine there's some big event in the world, something geopolitical,
Okay.
and it disrupts all the supply chains. You know how companies get the stuff they need. That could cause economic problems, which could lead to social unrest. And then you have cyber criminals who might try to take advantage of the whole situation.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. So risk management can't just be one department's job anymore. It needs to be everyone's job. It needs to be integrated into everything.
And that brings us back to agile governance. Right.
It all ties together. You need to be flexible and responsive to deal with all these complex, interconnected risks.
And then there's the whole issue of how fast technology is changing. It's like trying to hit a moving target.
It really is. As soon as you think you understand one risk, another one pops up. And it's not just about understanding the technology itself. It's about how people are using it and how they might misuse it. We talked about AI, but there's also blockchain, quantum computing, the metaverse. All these things are changing the risk landscape.
And we can't forget about the human element, right? We can have the best technology and systems,
Yeah.
but if people don't understand the risks or how to protect themselves, it doesn't really matter.
You're absolutely right. Humans are often the weakest link. People fall for phishing scams, use weak passwords, or accidentally leak information. We all make mistakes.
So how do you address that human factor? How do you actually change people's behavior?
It's about creating a culture of awareness, of security awareness. You have to train people to see suspicious activity and report it. Make sure they understand why strong passwords and multi-factor authentication are important, and make sure they feel comfortable saying something if they think something is wrong.
So it's not just about the technology, it's about changing how people behave.
Right. And that's hard. It can be one of the most difficult parts of risk management. but it's also one of the most important.
The book mentions a malware attack, not Petya. And it caused a lot of problems for Maersk. They're the world's biggest container shipping company. That's a good example of how all these risks can come together and cause a real crisis. Can you tell me more about that?
Not Petya, that was a wake-up call for a lot of businesses. It was very sophisticated malware,
Mm-hmm.
and it's spread incredibly fast. It crippled businesses all over the world, but Maersk was hit really hard. Their IT systems were basically shut down, and that affected their entire shipping network. Ships were stuck, ports were closed, and the cost was enormous.
Wow. So it wasn't just a cyber attack. It was a supply chain problem, a logistics problem, and a financial problem.
Exactly. And I think it really showed companies how important operational resilience is. The ability to deal with any kind of disruption, not just cyber attacks.
So how do you build that kind of resilience?
It starts with a really good risk assessment. You have to figure out what all the threats are, the things that could disrupt your business, natural disasters, pandemics, cyber attacks, anything.
So you have to look beyond the digital world, too.
Absolutely. And once you know what the risks are, then you have to assess how likely they are to happen and how bad the impact would be. This helps you decide what to focus on.
So you're not trying to prevent everything, just the things that are most likely to happen and that would cause the most damage.
Right. And then you come up with ways to reduce the risk. Things like diversifying your supply chain, having backups, having a good plan for incidents, and training your employees on what to do in a crisis.
So having layers of protection.
Yes. And being prepared for the worst case scenario.
Makes sense. And all of this comes back to the CRMP.
Absolutely. The principles of managing risk, they're the same everywhere. You can apply the CRMP framework to any kind of risk.
So it's not just a framework for cybersecurity. It's a framework for making sure your operations can keep running no matter what.
That's a great way to put it.
We've covered a lot in this part of our deep dives. Is there one big thing you'd want our listeners to take away as they're thinking about all these challenges?
I think the most important thing to remember is that risk management is everyone's job. It's not just for the IT department or the security team. Everyone in the company needs to be aware and involved.
And it's about taking action now,
Yeah.
not waiting until something bad happens.
Exactly. Don't wait for a crisis to hit. Think about risk all the time. Make it part of your company culture, part of how you make decisions and do business every day.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of work to build that kind of culture in a company.
It is. It takes time. You need everyone to be on board.
So thinking back to those excerpts, is there anything that really stood out to you as you were reading them and thinking about your own work?
You know what really struck me? They talk a lot about how important it is to keep learning and adapting. They say that, in this world where everything's changing so fast, you can't just stand still. Businesses need to keep learning about new threats, new technologies, and, new ways to do things, new best practices.
Always be learning, right?
Exactly. You got to be curious and stay up to date and be willing to change how you do things.
That's what we try to do on the show, too.
Yeah, and I think it's good advice for anyone, not just people who work in cybersecurity.
So as we wrap things up, is there one last thought, something you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I'd say the most important thing to remember is that risk management isn't just about avoiding bad things. It's also about making good things happen.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's about taking risks, calculated risks, so you can grow and innovate, but also having things in place to manage those risks.
So it's not about getting rid of risk completely.
No, not at all.
It's about understanding it
Yeah,
and managing it.
exactly.
You can even use it to your advantage.
Exactly. I mean, risk is just part of doing business, especially these days. The key is to think about it strategically.
Well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. The fourth industrial revolution, cybersecurity, risk management, AI, operational resilience. It's been a really interesting conversation.
I agree.
I always learn so much from these deep dives. And for our listeners, if you want to learn more, check out the book, Building a Cyber Risk Management Program. That's by Brian Allen and Brandon Bapst. It really goes into detail on all this.
It's a great book.
So until next time, keep diving deep.